So we are setting out on a 6-week journey I do not recommend. We are going to spend 6 weeks with the minor prophets as we do this lead up to Lent. Although I think what we will hear, what will be helpful, is the foundation their ministries lay for Jesus' ministry. A few words about prophets and minor prophets echoed in the bulletin insert that I made for you all that's there if you're nerdy enough to want to look at it. It helped to get me, making it helped to get me and my head in the right place. Prophets exist throughout the life of Israel, but unfortunately there are multiple words Hebrew uses for them that speak to different abilities. So, for instance, Elijah is never called a prophet, he's called a man of God, because he was understood to be someone who was so very in God's presence that the presence of God couldn't wipe off him, right? And then there are seers, and there are the word prophet most directly translates from the word nabi. So a nabi is like Samuel, who anoints Saul and David on God's behalf. So there's this long trajectory, and unfortunately we use one word to talk about all of it. And it gets complex, because one of the things we would hear Amos say, for instance, if we read all of Amos this morning, which I didn't do to you, you're welcome, is Amos would say, "I'm not a prophet." Well, that's weird, because he's in the prophets section of our book. But he means prophet in a different way than he would ascribe to being a prophet himself. Because prophets of his day, generally speaking, worked for the king. And in his day, they were presumed to be corrupt. They were the excusers of the political idolatry and making it look like it's all okay with a veneer of worship and theological language. Amos has no love for prophets, nor do any of the literary prophets. So the literary prophets begin in 760 with Amos. He's the very first literary prophet. They run down through Malachi and 3rd Zechariah in 500 to 450 BCE. It's a very short period of time. They're prophets, but they're literary prophets because they wrote down what they said, and we have them as books in the Bible. And of them, there are major prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and there are minor prophets, and that is not an estimation of their value. As it says in your handout, the scroll of Isaiah is about 26 feet long. You couldn't have put anything else on that scroll. For instance, Samuel, the work of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, there's no difference in that break. It's just it got too long for a single scroll. It's like Sound of Music on VHS. You got to put the second videotape in. It's still the same movie. It's not Infinity Wars and Endgame, two different movies that can't be watched without each other. Those are 1st and 2nd Avengers Endgame. This is really just one book split into two mediums, which was a thing before we had, the cloud. So minor prophets are just, they were briefer, and they could all fit on a single scroll. So we have them in canonical order, all on one scroll of stitched together papyrus parchment. And that made them minor just because they were short-winded. Though if you read all of Amos, you would find it hard to imagine he's the short-winded one. If you read the 66 books of Isaiah, you'd agree. So minor prophets are simply that, and we begin with Amos. Amos takes the stage in 760 BCE. He is the first literary prophet, and while a contemporary of Isaiah, he gets going first. Now, you're going to get disparate facts about Amos, largely because the town he claims to be in, the best known town by that name, is in the southern kingdom. That's right, just to make this more confusing, Israel is two different kingdoms right now. They split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And to make matters more confusing, while you think of Jerusalem as being in Israel, Jerusalem is in Judah. And typically, the prophets speak about Judah staying faithful longer than Israel. The fact that it's a northern aggressor and the northern kingdom falls first is also just a geopolitical reality. But we read into this sort of theology. So it's often said that Amos was a farmer. People like the idea that he was a poor farmer from the south, and he journeyed up to the northern kingdom and was a prophet in these ways. More likely, Amos is a fairly wealthy farmer. In fact, he's speaking against his own people, his own way. So captivated he is by these visions he gets from God and God's plumb line that he is speaking out against the very things he used to practice. And while he says, I'm a farmer, not a prophet, have you ever run into people in Idaho and they say, oh, I'm just a farmer, by which they mean they have more money than God, right? So Amos says, oh, I'm not a prophet, I'm a farmer. Now, everything about the literary nature of Amos's work indicates that he's an exceptionally well-trained, well-educated in prophetic ministry. So if he was not by birth a prophet, when he got his call, he went to prophet school. And he took the crash course and became very good at it. So he is, I'm just a farmer, much like many people today claim they're just farmers who have more money than God. So Amos is actually probably from the northern kingdom, probably a person of some wealth and significant education who becomes convicted by the set of visions to speak God's word in a radically new way. Understand, Amos's ministry was so disjunctive to the life of Israel that they began to talk about Amos's God. Not our God, but Amos's God. Which is, I want to get into that final little, before we deep dive into what is getting Amos working. I want that little interaction at the end of chapter 7 that we read. By the way, this is going to get harder and harder each week, but trying to find 2 selections to sum up the work of an entire prophet is not easy. I chose ones that have well-traveled alliterations like the plumb line and justice rolling down like water that are demonstrative. But I really wanted to include this little interaction between Amos and Azariah. Because, friends, we're on the wrong side of that one. So what basically happens is Amos is speaking his visions, speaking his prophetic ministry. Part of why we believe he may have written down and become a literary prophet is because nobody would listen to him when he spoke it in person. So he wrote it down to save his wisdom for posterity and started a whole different school of prophets who followed in that footstep. But Amos is speaking his vision, and we get this little piece where Azariah says to Jeroboam, yeah, Israel cannot bear with this guy. Now, that's not new. Elijah used to get called the troubler of Israel by Ahab. So we're used to prophets being in contention. But essentially, Azariah comes to Amos in the full interaction, basically says, this is your time to run. And run fast. And run far. And that word, well, the connection was made at first light, is a word very like the people who looked at Martin Luther King Jr. and as well-meaning Protestant clergy said, you need to stop pushing this justice agenda. We need time to get on board with you. And to whom Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the letter to Birmingham jail. There is a reason history recorded and held on to the letter to the Birmingham jail, and history held on to the book of Amos and not the book of Azariah. He is the high priest. His job is to keep the status quo going. He is the decent and in order guy who comes up alongside Amos, all well-meaning, to say, dude, chill. And maybe run, because I'm about to charge you with treason. But I don't really want to kill you, which maybe means he was a little worried that Amos's God was his God too. But he had interests to protect. This is the rub between the I'm not a prophets and the actual prophets of the day, right? The prophets of the day are what we think of as 1980s televangelists. About a year ago, we all realized now we are all televangelists. So we're saying, hey, I'm just a preacher from Idaho. I'm not a televangelist. And Amos is doing that with Azariah. But the reason that we need to understand this rub is that more often, we spend far more time listening to Azariah than we do to Amos. We spend far more time wanting to promote the voices of maintaining the status quo, of reverencing the past, and holding at bay or sticking our head in the sand about what is coming. And this is another key point of all of the prophets. While they are steeped in ancient texts and practices and keen observers of the present day, Amos's first and second chapter are keen insights into all of those different nations. He understands the names of their rulers, the way they work, and has divined punishments that are fitting to the cultural worldview of each of those nations. Now, he has had divine vision. He is clearly in tune to the miraculous. And I say that because in 760 BCE, Israel is in a time of deep prosperity and relative okayness. The Assyrian Empire has been decimated by a 100-year war with the Arameans. They are not a power on the world stage. For Amos in 760 BCE to say, not only will Israel and Judah, but all of the kingdoms formerly in the Davidic kingdom will all get conquered by a power out of the north, is a non-intuitive leap. But he backs his non-intuitive leap up with keen analysis of the geopolitical world. He's well informed, steeped in the past, keen observers of the present moment. But everything about prophets is oriented to the future. They are seeking God and God's moral world order. Language we might call the kingdom of God. And they have a founding premise that it's not in this present moment. So everything about prophets is forward-looking. I went to a training once and they said, never tell people about the used-to-be church you are. Right? Oh, there used to be 400 people in worship here. There used to be a great youth program. There used to be. This is what happens when, like Azariah, we begin to worship what we were and cling to it as hard as we can to deafen ourselves to any voices that disabuse us of the idea that we still are that. Amos is deeply embedded in a future vision and what has to happen to get us there. Because this present moment is intolerably non-aligned with what needs to happen to get us there. And he's going to set that tone that will be found in each and every one of the works of the prophets, which is one of the things that tends to be why we don't want to listen to them very much. So you might think that the prophets, and when we get to the retributive voices of the prophets, we'll get a little bit of this, but a very little bit of this, would be a voice of, why do bad things happen to good people? You know, that ancient theodicy, problem of evil question. That is the wrestling of the wisdom literature of Scripture. It isn't the prophets' plight. They are not looking out to the world and saying, why are bad things happening to good people? They are actually looking out at the world saying, why are so many people that aren't very good living so well? The prophets look out at a world steeped in injustice and selfishness and say, this won't last. So we get to Amos's justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a flowing stream. Is that the word there? It's beautiful, isn't it? It should be terrifying. Did you hear that voice? The day of the Lord is dark, not light. Did any of you kind of go like, is that a misprint? Did Kristen read that wrong, right? So the day of the Lord, typically we Christians would think about that as the coming of Jesus, right? Would be light. The tender mercy dawning from, breaking forth from on high and flowing down into the world. That should be a good thing. That justice is a nice river coming down and making the world green and nice. But Amos looks out at the world and says, most of you all have been profiting from injustice. And when God's day comes, it won't be good news for you. Prophets also look out and regularly name the oppression of the poor and the widows. That particular phrase you should hold on to, the poor and the widows. Those people who had no power in the system. It might seem somewhat amazing to us given its theocratic nature, but Israel and Judah at that time were highly democratic in local governance. Elected officials in the community councils decided how things went down. Except it turned out that, generally speaking, the people who have the time on their hands to be on said councils are the people wealthy enough that they're not working in their own fields. So while democratically elected, they skewed to the highly wealthy. So when you go to war for 100 years, by the way, it costs money. And the taxing system that happened in the 100 years leading up to Amos's ministry put a heavy, heavy burden on the poor. In Israel, when you could no longer pay for your land, you sold it and became an indentured servant or a slave. Now, Israel's economic system allowed that all slaves were freed after 6 years. Amos doesn't necessarily have a problem with slavery. He has a deep problem with the rampant nature of it, and that we have systematically created a world in which the masses of people cannot afford the world. So it doesn't matter if they're freed every 6 years. They will end up back in the same plight over and over and over again. And this, for Amos, is tantamount to destroying God's vision for the world. The justice and righteousness Amos speaks about, those words are mishpat and tzedek in the Hebrew. And Amos views them not like abstract ideas the way you and I do, but they are nothing less than almost gods that flow out from God, that empower the people to live the life God has created for them. What Jesus might have called abundant life, right? I come to give you life and life abundantly. The justice and righteousness of God was something that we became filled up with, much the way you might think about communion and being given the tangible sign of God's grace and love. And Amos's issue with the worship life, the cultic worship life of Israel, was that's where you were supposed to get it. I know that my sermon's not going to do this, but you were supposed to come to worship today, and I was supposed to fill you up with the power of God, whereby you went out and made justice and righteousness happen everywhere you went, because it's literally bursting out your pores. So when Amos says, I despise, as God's voice, I despise your festivals and your rituals, and then says, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, what he means is the systems of this world that have been designed to benefit the rich and the classes of wealth and prestige, that world is damming up God's righteousness and justice from getting to the people. And the only resort left to God is to destroy the dam so that it may flow out in a Noah-like movement of justice and righteousness, washing away the crud that the world has become. This is why Jonathan Edwards says, we are sinners in the hands of an angry God, like a spider dangling before the dam that God will break. And yes, we don't maybe want to listen to that message, because as a general rule, you would like to go out feeling better than when you came in. Me too. Amos's point that we need to listen to keenly is it is not okay to make of our worship, to make of our priestly responsibilities in the world as a band-aid or a pretty blindfold to recognize that the world is no longer formed to create goodness for all creation. And when that is true, the only faithful active work that we can be about is to dismantle the structures preventing God's justice and God's righteousness. Which is why Azariah says, get out of town. So what then do we do with that? When we listen to Amos preach and speak about the need for everyone, very important to Amos is this embeddedness in land, the freedom that land has for you. I hear Jesus say, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, right? When Amos confronts a world that strips people of their land and their dignity to the wealth of a few at the expense of the many, Amos says that world has to die in order for God's world to rise from that grave. And I mean it to sound like Jesus on the cross and the empty tomb. A world order that has no justice and righteousness in it needs to die and pass away, that a new world order might begin to bubble up in spirit ways. And our calling as the people of God is to hold at bay our desire to silence Amos or make the excuses why this work isn't our work. And to lean into the future in which we might imagine that even at our own expense, we are seeking the housing and the homing of all God's people, the abundance and the empowerment of all God's creation, that we are seeking to build everybody up. That the first question we ask is, what's in it for me, is not what's in it for me, but a la that old quote, what do I have to give? We were in Philippians on Wednesday, We were talking about Paul's understanding of citizenship, formed very deeply out of Roman understandings of citizenship, in which it makes no sense to talk about the rights of citizenship without talking about the responsibilities of citizenship. Amos's I'm not a prophet, I'm a farmer, in the end may be a radical moment to say we are all here prophets of a future that is not our own. We are all here priests cultivating a world in which God will look down and see justice and righteousness. And it won't be scary to anyone, because what it is overturning is embraced by everyone. And Amos leaves us there, puzzling and wondering. Amos and Azariah. Amos and Azariah. Which one are we inviting over for dinner?